Okay, I'm going to talk about something a little bit different, which is very much connected to communication. I came across something on Wikipedia, which granted is maybe not the best source, but it is the most convenient and on hand. And the title of the article is basically List of Ethnic Slurs. And the introduction is, the following is a list of ethnic slurs, ethnophilisms, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, that are or have been used as insinuations or allegations about members of a given ethnicity, or to refer to them in a derogatory, pejorative, or insulting manner. For the purposes of this list, an ethnic slur is a term designed to insult others on the basis of race, ethnicity, or nationality. Each term is listed followed by its country or region of usage, a definition and a reference to that term. And it goes on the list, I'd say it's roughly 200 or 300 words that are considered ethnic slurs. For the purpose of this video, I am going to name some of them. I'm not going to censor myself, but I should emphasize I'm doing this solely to use terminology which is relevant to the video. I mean, it would be impossible to talk about it without referring to them directly. And I want to give my views on this. There are some terms that are better known than others, and like I say, it varies from country to country. But there's terms, for example, nigger. Okay, there I said it, which is obviously deeply offensive to black people in the United States. And there is historical context for that, for obvious reasons. There's other words that are seemingly largely forgotten today. There's a lot here, so I'm not going to name all of them, but there's others. Redskin refers to Native Americans. Pikey in the United Kingdom refers to Irish travellers. There's a very wide range of words here. Some are a lot more sort of identifiable than others. Limey is used in the United States and NL, that must be Netherlands. Lebo in Australia refers to a Lebanese person. Anyway, there's a lot of terms here. I'm not going to go through all of them. Guelo is used in China, southern China particularly, the south of mainland China and Hong Kong. It translates as a white man, loosely translated as foreign devil, more literally might be ghost dude, bloke, guy, etc. Gui means ghost. The colour white is associated with ghosts in China. A lo is a regular guy, a fellow, a chap, or a bloke. Once a mark of xenophobia, the word is now in general informal use. That must be Cantonese, because the term I know in Putonghua in Chinese is Lao Wai. I have had a few times in my life when I've had ethnic slurs directed at myself. I'm from Northern Ireland. When I first arrived in England, there were on more than one occasion I was called a paddy, which in Great Britain is basically a term for an Irish person. I think it's used in the United States as well, even though I'm from Northern Ireland, which is the British part. And when I was in China, once or twice I heard the term Lao Wai, which, like I said, means foreigner. It literally translates actually as old foreigner. There's a few things I want to say. I believe very strongly that how these terms are perceived depends on the intention of how they are being said. Personally, I avoid using any ethnic terms. Not because of political correctness, but just because I don't want to. I just don't. It's not my way of communicating. But I don't believe in political correctness, and I don't think that this is something that people should take to an extent whereby people have to watch every single word they say. Because when we have communication, sometimes background or identity does come into it. Obviously you're not going to go up to someone from another ethnic group and call them a greaser or a nigger or a hunky or whatever to their face. But what I'm talking about is context is very, very important. And I do think it is important that people can openly discuss these things. Clearly, if a white supremacist is using the N word in a certain way, he or she is doing it because they look down on black people, and vice versa for black supremacists when they use the term hunky. There are certain people in the British far right who would use the term Paki in a very derogatory manner. Others would say it's simply an abbreviation of Pakistani. I think it is very important to recognise the intention. For example, some people might use the term Brits. Sometimes I've heard that from Americans. Personally, I really don't care. I'm not offended by it. And we occasionally use the term Yanks. I think sometimes these sort of words have a semi-amicable tone about them, because especially countries that generally have, for the most part, a good relationship, I think it's almost like if you have two friends who kind of wind each other up and tease each other, the term is somewhat insulting, but it's got an amicable background. So when Americans talk about Brits, I honestly don't feel offended, because even some British people will use the term. Once or twice I've used it, referring to myself and my countrymen, us Brits or this and so on. Not on a regular basis, but I've done it before. And I know certainly some Americans use the term Yanks. There's many, many other examples. What I tend to think about is, if a term is generally seen as offensive, that is, if people from that group generally seem to get offended, I don't think people should use it. Not because I believe in political correctness, but because it's silly. It makes no sense to try to provoke people when there's really no need for it, and when you can communicate with them in another way. So, for example, I suspect the majority of Chinese people would see the term chinky as offensive, but I know some mainland Chinese who have heard the term and they didn't even realise it was an offensive term. I do think there's a difference between East and West in this. I believe the West is a lot more politically correct in our societies because of multiculturalism, also because we have got a track record of racism. Therefore, we're more sensitive today, and I would argue almost too sensitive. For example, apparently the term American-born Chinese can be seen as offensive. I don't understand how that can be seen as offensive. The description says because it then sets them apart from mainstream Americans, whatever that means. But the point is, America is a very diverse society anyway. There's hardly any American can claim they're 100% white American, because even white Americans mostly are descended from the British, so it's a country built by immigrants. So American-born Chinese to me is simply an adjective. I can't see how that is derogatory, because I imagine if someone wants to be offensive to Chinese people, they're not going to say, "Oh, you're an American-born Chinese." They're more likely to use a much more extreme terminology. Chink, for example, would be a lot more extreme. And again, just to emphasize, I'm not using those words because I believe in using them. I'm using them simply to describe the context that we are talking about. I couldn't make a video about ethnic slurs without naming them directly. I think a lot of this, though, for me, I've sort of split opinions. On one hand, I do think people need to understand historical context to understand why people do find certain terms offensive. And they need to understand the history in order to understand why people take it offensively. On the other hand, I think it would be quite sad if we got to a point where we were so sensitive that terms that are intended as amicable are immediately seen as offensive, just because they sound a little bit unusual. I mean, I don't think it's, I think it would be a very boring world if people were described simply by the demonym, i.e. American, Chinese, Italian, French, Ukrainian, etc. And if alternative terminology was completely wiped out because of the false premise that it is all offensive. I think if people are offended by it, then others definitely shouldn't use it just for the sake of it, and because they think that there's nothing wrong with it. And personally, I don't use any of these terms, but I don't think that people who do use them should automatically be branded as racist. I think that's ridiculous. Like I said, there's a difference between East and West. Now in China, the term Laowai is occasionally used. I don't mean it's widely used, but it is used. And in China, it's seen as perfectly acceptable. I remember a friend of mine, she was quite defensive about it, and she says, no, 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 it's not racist. It simply means old foreigner. But there are Chinese in the West who would immediately object to the term chink. So there's different perceptions in different parts of the world. I think Eastern countries are a lot more casual about words connected with race. Certainly in China, they would talk about black people in a way that would be absolutely shocking by Western standards. Because it is seen as, in their mind, it is really not racist. In fact, an interesting thing is the whole idea of racism. I don't believe there's even a word that can be translated into Putonghua from the English word racism. So there is different perceptions in different parts of the world. In the West, the whole idea of racism is extremely taboo. And to some extent with good reason, because like I say, we have had a history of racism. Genuine racism. But the truth is, there is derogatory terms used all over the world. Now, in terms of Laowai, on the occasion, very occasional time, I heard that word. Did I feel offended? No, I didn't. In fact, I kept a journal of my journeys in China, and I called it Diary of a Laowai. I am a Laowai, and I don't care. Because it literally translates as old foreigner, and it means semi-amicable. Guaylo is more derogatory because that translates as white devil, and certainly I think people in the south of China need to be aware that some white people would certainly see that as quite certainly not an amicable term. Would you like to be called a white devil? Of course not. So there's difference between Guaylo and Laowai, and I think maybe people in Hong Kong and the south of China that casually use that need to be aware that if they were in the West and someone called them a chink, they might not like it. But then again, it comes down to different perceptions of racism as well. On some level, there is a bit of hypocrisy here, because I think, if you're from a country that thinks racism is okay, and then you come to a country where it's taboo and you decide to be offended, you need to take a reflection about what your own country is like in terms of attitudes to people of different skin colour. But I also believe that I hate political correctness, and I think it really shackles relaxing expression. I wouldn't say free speech necessarily, because alternative terms can be used. It's not like necessarily that the whole concept is being censored, but I do think it's unfortunate if people automatically get offended when a term is not intended in a bad way. So going back, for example, to Guaylo, personally I wouldn't necessarily like being called a white devil, but then I would also recognise that maybe the person saying that term, if it is common in the south of China, genuinely doesn't mean it in a hostile way. It's become part of their language, it's casual. I know even, for example, the term Negro, to give another example, up until probably the early 60s, it was widely seen as an acceptable term, both by the white and black community, and there were many black people who widely used it. Today it would be seen as very archaic. And even between Western countries there's differences. The term Oriental, for example, in Britain that's seen as relatively okay. It's not a particularly taboo term, but it's my understanding that in the United States it's seen as derogatory. That's obviously referring to East Asian people. I've used the term before, Oriental, and my Chinese friends don't seem to care about it. In fact, I've never heard it sort of used in a derogatory manner. Anyway, what I'm getting at is this all depends on context. If people are clearly saying something to be provocative, or say for example you have a gang and they attack someone and then they use certain terms, then of course people have a right to be offended and feel that such words are intimidating. But sometimes this can go too far. I heard recently that Benedict Cumberbatch had to apologise because he used the term coloured, I think he said coloured Americans or coloured actors. He was referring to black people. I believe nowadays the politically correct term is African American, but then no doubt some people will find that offensive. So when you get to a point where pretty much every word is seen as offensive, then you think, well, how the hell are you supposed to communicate? For example, black, African American, coloured, you know, some people would see each of those terms as acceptable, many others would see them as unacceptable. I think coloured's a little bit old-fashioned, but I would use African American because African American people themselves use the term. I certainly wouldn't use the M word because I understand the historical context and I think there's no reason to use it. There is a debate, of course, that this is used by American rappers, and well, again, it comes down to context. A lot of that is to do with, and actually it's the same when it comes to homophobia, because the term fag, for example, would be seen as a homophobic term when used by a straight person, but there are gay men who use the term freely. In other words, something that is intended as an insult can sometimes be used to empower the person that was originally the victim of the insult. So, just in conclusion, I would argue that all of this really comes down to context. Personally, I don't think people should casually use ethnic slurs. I don't think it's particularly intelligent. I think it's a little bit lazy. But at the same time, I don't think people should be so sensitive and so politically correct that they respond with rage every time they hear a certain word, because they need to understand the context it's coming from. So someone is making a genuine mistake because they genuinely don't know which term is acceptable, then the other person should understand that and not, you know, demonize that person as a nasty racist. People just need to stop being so sensitive. They also need to be more understanding of historical context. So certain words are taboo for a reason. Anyway, let me know your thoughts on this. Let me know which part of the world you're commenting from. I know a lot of my subscribers are American, and I do believe political correctness is very widespread in the States, probably even more intense in the UK, although it's strong in the UK as well. If you don't know what political correctness is, this is a term that's used in English. It basically means trying to censor your own language so as not to offend people. There are certain terms I'm sure are used solely to be derogatory. Raghead, for example, is used to refer to Arab men, and that is, there's nothing amicable about that. It is entirely a derogatory term. So again, context comes into it. Anyway, let me know which part of the world you're from, maybe even which part of the United States, or which part of your country, because it could vary from region to region. And let me know what the situation is there regarding sensitivities, regarding maybe controversial terms, anything. And I'm not going to censor this. You can write absolutely anything on the comments thread, as long as you're not just, you know, trying to shit stir or spread hatred against the group. But what this comes down to is a few issues: political correctness, sensitivity, context. Personally, I don't use such terms, but I don't believe that people who do should automatically be branded a racist. I'll put a link to the article. Thanks for watching.